My Hero Academia Abridged is the most disappointing experience since Anime Strike. It's almost mind-boggling how in just one episode it managed to do almost everything wrong. Coming off the heels of one of the most critically acclaimed Abridged series of all time, you'd think that something witty had figured out how Abridged series were supposed to work. But apparently they're still just as lost as everyone else. So what exactly went wrong? Why does My Hero Abridged feel like just another Abridged series that will eventually fade away, while SAO Abridged still stands tall as a leader in its field? Well, don't worry. That's what I'm here for. Let's jump in, shall we? Number 1. Putting the comedy cart before the story horse. Before we try to figure out what went wrong with one series in particular, we first have to understand what the point of all of this is. What exactly is an Abridged series, and what is the reason for one to exist in the first place? According to the most trusted source of knowledge known to man, Wikipedia, the act of abridgment can be described as a condensing or reduction of a book or other creative work into a shorter form while still maintaining the unity of the source. In layman's terms, an abridged work is a retelling of a story with a shorter length while still making sure that the story is coherent enough to be recognizable. However, in the context of YouTube and fan abridging, this practice has been somewhat altered. Here, an abridged series can basically be viewed as a more comedic, semi-parodical version of the original. Very often, the series is created to poke fun at flaws in the original or reference running jokes within the fandom. This is pretty obvious when you look at what is considered to be the first abridged series as we understand the term, Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged. The first episode is very clearly poking fun at the original anime, specifically its dubbed version, through the lens of comedic exaggeration. Why does Kaiba blatantly break the rules of a well-known card game even though he's obviously winning?
Screw the rules, I have money.
Not only does this work as a witty one-liner to get a good laugh out of the viewer, but it also informs us about Abridged Kaiba's character. He's a rich kid who don't take no guff from other people and lets his money do the talking. But what's really great is that this is basically how he acts in the original series, just without being as on the nose about it. And so his character hasn't been flanderized to the point of being unrecognizable. This, in my not-so-humble opinion, is how you can easily identify a mediocre abridged series versus any abridged series that's actually worth watching. And perhaps this could be construed as a controversial opinion, but it seems pretty obvious if you look at the most popular works in this genre. If an abridged series is only made with the intent of barely retelling the original, but it's funny this time, then I must ask you, what is the point of it even existing? A very large portion of anime are already comedies to some extent, so if you're not going to touch the meta elements of a series at all, then you're basically just doing an actual abridgment of the show, but with your own shitty jokes jammed in. If you're just here to tell your bad jokes over anime footage, then you're wasting everyone's time. A great abridged series retells the story in a comedic fashion, but also addresses the flaws of that story or includes elements of the discussion surrounding it to some degree when retelling it. In essence, you could say that you're putting your own spin on a pre-existing story. And while this does raise some ethical questions about intellectual property, in the realm of fan-made content, I see it as a perfectly acceptable style of writing, so long as your spin on the story is interesting enough to carry its own weight and not rely solely on the original story itself. If you're like me and at one point you tried out a lot of abridged series hoping to find the next big thing, then you probably noticed very quickly that most of the people who make abridged series don't really know how to write a story. They've duped themselves into thinking that because the story was already there the first time, they don't have to put in any effort themselves. And it's a fallacy you'll find in almost everything that's not made by Team 4-Star or Little Karibo. This is also why so many people, myself included, consider SAO Abridged to be the best abridged series out there, because it actually felt like something witty was retelling the story of Sword Art Online with their own ideas interlaced into the main plot. But you don't need me to tell you that. Plenty of people have already pointed out why SAO Abridged is great. And the fact that a fan-made remake of an anime already has several analysis videos about it should speak volumes about how well crafted its story and characters are. But this does lead us to another major concept of creating an abridged series. Number 2. Choosing a target. SAO might possibly be the most contentious popular anime ever made in regards to public perception of its overall quality. A lot of people love SAO, which is why it's popular in the first place. But a lot of people also despise SAO and think it's a completely broken and hackneyed story with some of the worst characters ever put to animation. Is SAO the worst anime ever made? Well, no, but I wouldn't exactly say it's something worth watching either, and there's a whole slew of reasons why I think that. The point is, there's a lot of discussion to unpack when talking about SAO, and that gave Something Witty an incredible breadth of material to work with in constructing the characters that they would use in this series. As such, the characters they created feel even more complex than the ones in the original anime, thus catapulting SAO Abridged into the limelight. But it doesn't just have to be a series with a controversial reputation. Basically, any series with enough heated conversation about it, or even enough in-jokes that fans make about it, can be used as a vehicle for an abridged series. Dragon Ball Z is still a beloved anime, but there's plenty about it that can be made fun of in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. And fans are okay with it because they've acknowledged these ideas, either openly or subconsciously, for years, and they like to see that they weren't the only ones thinking that way. This is also why I feel like Akame ga Kill Abridged was such a wasted opportunity. Outside of the joke they used to introduce the main character, it doesn't really do anything with the absolutely immense amount of discussion, both positive and negative, that surrounded the series at the time, and instead just uses the same unfunny jokes and annoying voice acting that lesser abridged creators always use. The point I'm trying to make here is that making an abridged series is a lot more complicated than just saying funny things over anime footage. If that's all it needed, then there are plenty of other places I could get that without wasting a half hour on one video. It takes both an intimate knowledge of the original series and the discussion surrounding it, as well as the ability to tell a functioning story that stands on its own. With all that in mind, let's come back to the main point of this video. Number 3, what the fuck am I even looking at? So this first episode opens on what can only be described as substanceless, stereotypical abridged humor. A character we don't know screams like a retard, and then something explodes. And that's supposed to be funny, I guess. Keep in mind that this is the very first joke of this brand new abridged series, so my expectations have already plummeted to below my ankles. And I can't even touch my ankles anymore, so it's gonna be kinda hard to pick it back up. This gag is then followed up by a nonsensical rambling about how this explosion caused a nuclear war that decimated the population, but then jumps right back to the present day and basically says that none of that really matters. It's a total non sequitur that exists solely for shock humor, and it's not even good at doing that because there aren't any good visuals they could pair with it to amplify the meaning behind it. In contrast, the opening gag of SAO is not only funny and insightful, but also well-timed and properly paced. It starts with a cold open on Kirito diving into the full version of SAO for the first time, and there's even a sense of tension before his virtual avatar appears, teasing us ever so slightly with whatever joke we're about to witness. Then, once he gets to look around, he becomes disgusted by the amount of in-game space that has been designated to real-world advertisements, and then complains even more when he discovers that the tool to block ads costs money. Advertising plugs in media are a common source of annoyance for many people, so this clever integration of real-world subject matter into the fictional world of SAO is a nice touch. Furthermore, as we get deeper into the story, we realize that this is also something that this version of Kirito would care enough about to get extremely frustrated by it. So it also serves as a character building moment exemplifying his utter lack of tolerance towards stupidity and incompetence. It's so brilliant that I'm honestly shocked that these two opening scenes were written by the same people. As tempting as it is to go line by line and explain how everything in this episode is either utterly nonsensical or completely broken, I don't got the time nor the patience to do that, so I'll try to stick to the broader points as much as possible. Number 4, Midoriya is utterly nonsensical and completely broken. After this terrible gag, we learn that the opening narration was being delivered by our main character, Izuku Midoriya, who proceeds to then apologize to the audience for rambling. This is a reference to the fact that the real Midoriya sometimes rambles under his breath about nerd shit, but I'm honestly kinda puzzled that, narratively speaking, they actually portray this characteristic in a more subdued manner than in the actual anime. In the original, he mutters under his breath all the time about stuff and it kinda creeps people out. It's a fun little gag to convey how Midoriya can get so involved in his own hero obsession that he fails to pick up on certain social cues. But in the abridged version, almost all of these ramblings are in his head and people don't hear him say anything. People ramble in their heads all the time. Heck, I was just rambling in my head about how I want to murder all of you in your sleep. But that don't make me a murderer yet. Likewise, having Midoriya ramble in his own head doesn't actually make us think he's a crazy person. The closest it comes to conveying that sentiment is when he thinks about his All Might detective fanfiction, which comes off as so horribly forced and unfunny that I hesitate to even say that it supports this aspect of his character. Aside from that, Abridged Midoriya feels like a totally hollow and unengaging character up until around 10 minutes in a scene which is portrayed in the most tone-deaf and tonally confused manner I've ever seen from an abridged series. It's the exact same scene from the anime where Midoriya has an emotional breakdown after learning that he'll never have a quirk and can never be a great hero like All Might. And the scene is lifted almost word for word from the original anime, but we'll get into why that makes it awful later on. For now, all you need to understand is that while a bridge series can tackle deeper, even poignant and emotionally stirring subject matters, these moments don't come 10 minutes into the first fucking episode. It takes time to build up to these more serious moments, especially when you're writing something that's primarily aimed at making people laugh. SAO Abridged was damn near flawless at this. Episode 8 had an incredibly emotional and triumphant moment because of how perfectly its two lead characters had been built up prior to that, and how their emotional arcs finally intertwined permanently at this episode's climax. Episode 10 I can only describe as the seminal moment for both Kirito and Asuna, as the repurposing of Yui as a child they are emotionally unprepared to handle highlights the massive neuroses and personality flaws that sit at the core of these characters. You don't get any moments in episode 1 where you're supposed to seriously feel sorry for Kirito. In fact, the way he cries at the end of the episode is played for laughs, because Something Witty knew that the audience didn't have enough emotional investment in these characters yet. Anyway, after this incredibly tacky and forced emotional moment, we get a scene that tells us Midoriya is trying to repress these memories, which is the closest to actually saying anything meaningful about this character. But because the story doesn't go anywhere with this, it feels more like an inconsistency rather than a character-driven gag. Midoriya still tries to save Bakugo at the end without any hesitation because that's who his character is. What frustrates me is that they could have tackled this from so many other angles that would have been infinitely more enjoyable than just play it straight. Maybe they could have turned Midoriya into like a battered housewife with how abusive Bakugo is towards him, and then played up those aspects in this scene. Or maybe this could have been the scene where Midoriya finally snaps from all the supposed repressed memories, and he just leaves Bakugo to die before realizing that that's not what a true hero would do, and so he reluctantly charges in to save him while still acknowledging the pain that Bakugo put him through. Midoriya has received a lot of criticism from the fandom, usually unjustly so, about how emotionally weak he is, so this could have been a great moment to comment on that. Either way, how they actually did it is so bafflingly stupid that it feels like the two halves of this episode were written by entirely different groups of people because this character doesn't make any fucking sense. Number 5. Oh dear God, what have they done to Bakugo? Regardless of whether you think Midoriya is a good MC or not, I think most of us can agree that Bakugo is a really strong character. both within the original series and in the broader context of the trope he fulfills. He's Midoriya's main rival, and their clashes form some of the most impacting moments in the entire series. The original story is able to accomplish this because of a simple balance between similarity and contrast. On the surface, Bakugo seems like the polar opposite of Midoriya. He's incredibly cocky and arrogant, but has the skills to back up all his talk. He was born with an incredibly powerful quirk that attracted praise from everyone he met, and so it led him to always assume that he was the best in the room wherever he went. He's basically if Vegeta was a high school jock, and I say that as a good thing. However, despite his obvious contrast to Midoriya, he is also very similar to him in possibly the most important ways. Both of them look up to All Might, and both of them want to be heroes. You would think that it's the latter that truly cements them as strong rivals, and while that is certainly important, it's the former that ties everything together in a neat little bow, especially later on in the story. If Bakugo were truly a hollow, attention-seeking brat, then he'd probably look up to someone like Endeavor, who only wants to be number one because he believes it's his destiny. But Bakugo specifically looks up to All Might, the symbol of peace. And it's because his personality is so fundamentally different from All Might's that Bakugo ends up failing where he otherwise should have succeeded. And this aspect of Bakugo's character is intentionally reversed in My Hero Abridged, and it fucking sucks. Now don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that making changes to characters is bad for Abridged series. Some of the most memorable parts of Abridged characters come from how they differ from their original counterparts. Abridged Kirito is one of the best characters to ever exist in an Abridged series specifically because he is significantly different from his original iteration. He doesn't necessarily fix the complaints that people who hate SAO point out about the series, but rather he elaborates on those complaints, while also adding in new character flaws to flesh him out more, and this makes him easier to relate to. He's less of a jumbled mess of character traits used to fit a particular scene, and more a completely dysfunctional human being with deeply rooted personality disorders. And that makes him a more likable person because most people are kinda shit, and they like seeing themselves in fictional characters to some degree, even if it's the parts they don't like about themselves. There's nothing wrong with changing a character when making an Abridged series, but the question you gotta ask is why make this change? Abridged Bakugo hates All Might because he views him as a washed-up has-been who doesn't make his fights look cool enough, and it's a change they've made to pretty much every character in this episode except Midoriya. We'll get into why this is fucking stupid a bit later, but in reference to Bakugo specifically, it completely ruins an otherwise fantastic character dynamic between himself and Midoriya. If you want a better example of how to keep a rivalry intact when abridging, you need look no further than DBZ Abridged. Not only is the rivalry between Goku and Vegeta the same as the original at a core level, but the added stupidity of Abridged Goku incites further frustration and outrage from Vegeta, thus making their rivalry even more potent. In My Hero Abridged, these characters are no longer rivals, and Bakugo is literally just a bully. This is not an exaggeration of his original character, but rather a simplification of it. Now you'd think that would be part of the abridging process, making a character simpler so that the story can move forward quicker. But in practice, that's not really what happens most of the time. Sure, some characters get simpler, but a lot of others end up being even more complex than their originals because the writers are attempting their own form of commentary in order to bring a new version of that character to life. Abridged characters are not simple caricatures. They're entirely new versions of the characters we already know that use that character's foundation to tell a slightly different story. Even Friendship is Witchcraft understands this concept better than this fucking pile of doo-doo. Oh my god, I can't believe I'm using bronies to provide an example of good parody. Number 6, missing the very obvious tree in the middle of an empty field. Of all the characters in My Hero Abridged, All Might is probably the one that most resembles his original iteration, and you'd think that after all my complaints so far that this would be a good thing. But it's not. And the reason for that is while All Might himself is mostly the same, the context around him has been so immensely fucked that this character no longer works in this setting. You see, back in SAO Abridged, Something Witty used the setting of being trapped in a video game to incorporate more video game related humor, and they even attempted to comment on video game culture in certain areas. This is especially apparent in the later episodes where characters in Alfheim are basically forced to roleplay in the game. And this certainly wasn't the first time an Abridged series had done this. Much like how 50% Off commented on the inherently fetishistic nature of fandoms, and Hellsing Abridged commented on what constitutes offensive discussion within a fandom, SAO Abridged is another in a line of Abridged series that understand the source material and fandom enough to make meaningful commentary that goes well beyond simple parody. My Hero Abridged attempts to do the same, but fails so horribly that even thinking about it makes me want to vomit blood. At one point, Abridged Bakugo says,
"Being a hero is about looking awesome and making millions from brand deals."
Which is probably the single most obvious thing you could say about modern hero culture. So much so that Disney had already done it over 20 years ago. But that's okay. In theory, this is actually a pretty interesting topic to explore. The hypersaturation of superheroes in modern popular entertainment has left a lot of people feeling like these movies are cynical cash grabs that fail to actually capture the essence of being a superhero.
That isn't a superhero to me. A guy who stands there after everyone else is dead. That's like a rock star. I don't want to see movies about rock stars. Put the hero back in the superhero movies, because I think super might have taken over.
Again, I'm not saying that these criticisms are totally right, but this is a fairly popular sentiment that merits discussion, so I can at least understand what Something Witty was trying to do here. It's a discussion that is worth having. But what causes this discussion to fail is that they specifically chose My Hero Academia to bring this discussion into play, because My Hero is basically the polar opposite in tone from the cynical cash grab superhero movies that people are often complaining about. As Giguk once said,
My Hero Academia's simple fights are only there to showcase the writing and world building, because these fights are not about the fights.
And while this is easily the most basic bitch misunderstanding of shonen battle anime on the whole that you could possibly have, it's still true in regards to My Hero. The fights are all about the story and the characters, carefully constructing them so that everything develops in meaningful ways. It has an incredibly optimistic and lofty tone, even more so than many other shonen battle anime that surround it, because the entire point of the series is to inspire hope in its audience and tell them that everyone has what it takes to be a hero as long as they utilize their talents in the right way. So to take such an overly optimistic story and cram as much cynicism into it as you possibly can is not only stupid and mean-spirited, but also does the exact opposite of what an Abridged series is supposed to do. While many Abridged series do alter the plot, very rarely do they alter the overall message of the story. DBZ Abridged is still an epic shonen battle series filled with iconic clashes and lengthy character development. Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged is still an over-the-top yet heartfelt story about playing card games with your friends. Hellsing Abridged is still an absolute gore-fest filled with potentially offensive elements. Even SAO Abridged, despite how much depth they've added to the characters, is still a power fantasy about being trapped in a virtual world. While there are still hints of optimism scattered throughout this episode, the overall tone and story of My Hero Abridged are saying something entirely different. When you have an entire crowd of people booing All Might for saving the day just because he made it rain on accident, it makes me think that Something Witty didn't really understand the point of the original story at all. If this were another superhero anime like, say, One Punch Man, where the concept of heroism actually is put through a more cynical lens by having the main character be a hero just because it's his hobby and he doesn't seem to have any grand ambitions about protecting the world from evil, then this concept would have actually made sense. But cramming this idea into a series that represents the exact opposite of this idea means it only creates dissonance within the audience that already understands the main story. This is no longer abridging because it misses the entire point of the original work. Number 7. I can't put enough emphasis on the word editing, so I won't even try. This point is pretty simple to explain, but don't mistake that for it being a minor nitpick because it's actually my biggest problem with the entire second half of this episode. Aside from heavily altering the script, Abridged series tend to heavily edit the source footage as well. This is done for 2 reasons. 1, to rearrange shots, in particular lip flaps, so that the abridged script is not limited by how the original property is shot, and 2, to avoid copyright, because licensing companies are very strict about how their intellectual property is used. Believe me, I know. Because of this need for creative freedom, Abridged series have developed a particular style of editing and shot composition that both allows the script to express more unique ideas, as well as give a more comedic accent to certain scenes. Many times you'll encounter a shot of a character standing almost completely still, but the mouth flaps are edited so that they can continue talking for more time than the original animation allows. It's a trick of the trade that, while seemingly a bit unprofessional at a glance, has a certain charm to it on its own. I bring this up because the second half of My Hero Abridged's first episode does not feel like it's being edited to be an abridged series at all. In fact, it seems to have practically no major edits whatsoever, or at least none that change the original scenes enough to be noticed. And with this we run into a problem on the totally opposite end of the spectrum from what I've described so far. Yes, drifting too far away from the original is an issue because it creates a disconnect with the audience, but if you stick too close to the original, then your audience might as well just watch the original instead. The scene in My Hero Abridged where Midoriya asks All Might if he can be a hero even if he doesn't have a quirk is practically identical to how it plays out in the original anime. The timing of shots and how shots are cut together have barely changed, the dialogue is mostly the same, albeit slightly exaggerated, and they even use the same piece of background music. At this point, the writers aren't even attempting to create their own take on the story, but rather a barely truncated version of what already exists with no creativity added whatsoever. This is what I'm talking about when I say that an abridged series should be able to stand on its own merits apart from the original work. There is no attempt to critique, dissect, or alter the original product in any way during this scene, and we have moved from the realm of potential fair use into straight-up plagiarism. This is not hyperbole. I sincerely believe that something witty has just flat-out plagiarized My Hero Academia in this moment, and they deserve to be called out for it because it's not just lazy, it's insulting. Number 8, fuck it, I'm done. I could continuously nitpick this episode for its terrible comedic timing and flagrant misuse of pre-established characters, and even some issues I didn't cover like poor audio mixing, but I hope that I've already made my point. In short, My Hero Abridged is deeply disjointed, fails to grasp exactly what it should be portraying, and in general comes across as extremely unentertaining, and I guess that's the most damning thing I could say about it. Sure, you can argue over the specifics of what makes an abridged series work, but at the end of the day, it's still just another unfunny YouTube video that failed to entertain. And that just sucks. Do you get it now? Can I drop the act soon? Can I free myself from this nightmare? Let me out. Let me out. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourketon Join, Christine Seibert, Call Me Catlord, Ryan Johnson, Jennifer Spencer, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.